Hello, my name is Linda Scholl. I am with a member of the Education Committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Demonstrating the Value of Regulation by Linking Job Requirements to Public and Patient Safety. This session will address an HRRI-sponsored study that aims to build evidence on the linkages between licensing requirements, public and patient safety, and specific job requirements in physical therapy. The speakers for this session are Christina Curnow, I even asked ahead of time, Curnow, and Lauren Mason. Christina is the founder and president of Skill Edge Research and Consulting. Lauren is a research consultant for Skill Edge Research and Consulting and an annual adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati. You can find their bios on the event app. They have valuable information to share, and we also encourage your participation. If you wish to ask questions during the Q&A portion, the members of the Education Committee will provide you with a microphone. Please abide by the ground rules in the program notebook so more attendees have a chance to ask questions. At the end of the session, please scan a QR code to complete your evaluation, and we really appreciate your feedback. And now we're going to turn the presentation over to Christina and Lauren.
Thank you. Do you want to go on the first slide? Thanks. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope everyone had a chance to get some of the great snacks that were outside. I'm Christina Curnow, and my background is in industrial and organizational psychology, and I do workforce-related research. And I'm delighted to be here presenting today with my co-author, Lauren Mason. We're going to talk about work that we've recently completed through Skill Edge Research and Consulting, where we looked at the strength of the relationships between physical therapy job requirements, occupational licensing requirements, and public and patient safety. And this work was sponsored by HRRI, and I want to thank them for allowing us to do this interesting work. If you go to the next slide, just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to cover our whole research process and talk to you in detail about the results that we found. And then we're going to conclude with audience discussion. We really want to hear your thoughts and input on this work and get your viewpoints on it. So without further delay, I'm going to, by way of introduction, as you all are well aware, occupational licensing plays an essential role in protecting the public and patient safety, especially in health-related fields. But despite this importance, we really know very little from an empirical perspective about how specific licensing requirements map onto job requirements and safety outcomes. So most prior studies have relied on secondary data sources like disciplinary records, which are really limited and may actually underreport safety concerns. So our project attempts to address this gap by collecting primary data from subject matter experts in physical therapy. We chose physical therapy because it involves direct, hands-on patient care, and it's guided by a fairly standardized set of licensing requirements. So the goals of our study were to estimate how well PT licensing requirements align with job demands and the need to safeguard patient safety. And so this project really offers a scalable framework that could be applied to licensing in other safety-sensitive occupations. Okay. So this study was guided by 3 core research questions. First, we asked whether physical therapy job requirements are directly linked to licensing requirements. So in other words, do the tasks and competencies expected on the job relate to what is required to obtain and maintain a license? Second, we examined whether job requirements themselves are tied to public and patient safety. Since PTs provide hands-on care, it's really important to understand which tasks have the greatest safety implications. And then finally, we make a third connection, which is, are licensing requirements aligned with safety outcomes? And together, these 3 questions form the foundation for our framework, of linking job demands, licensing, and safety in a really systematic way. So next I'm going to talk about our methodology. We began this work by coordinating with HRRI to identify subject matter experts, or SMEs, who could provide detailed insight into licensing requirements, job demands, and safety concerns. So here we were really looking for people who were well-rounded in the physical therapy occupation, people who had at least 10 years of experience, and then some who even had experience writing items for the national exam. And we also sought individuals that would represent different specialties within the occupation. So once the SMEs were recruited, we held an orientation session to familiarize everyone with the study, the purpose and the process and the expectations. And we also gathered their initial ratings through a survey. This orientation session really helped to ensure that the participants understood the survey, and then it gave them time to ask questions of us if they needed any kind of clarification. So after the initial survey ratings, we analyzed that data and we determined which responses might require further discussion during a focus group. And then in the focus group, the SMEs then discussed their responses and had an opportunity to re-rate their original ratings after hearing what others had to say. And then following the focus groups, we analyzed the data and reported out on our findings. And so across all of this, we had both qualitative and quantitative insights that were integrated to address all of the research questions. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of what we were measuring in this project. So we have three major categories of variables that we were looking at: the job requirements, the occupational licensing requirements, and then the public and patient safety. So first, we identified what job requirements we were going to look at. And these were based on the 2022 entry-level physical therapy practice analysis. That document outlines the tasks and competencies and responsibilities that are expected of newly licensed physical therapists. And it served as a kind of foundational benchmark, allowing us to explore the job of physical therapy and what it really entails. Second, for occupational licensing requirements, we looked at the standards from CAPD, which outline the competencies and clinical experiences that are required during training. We also looked at FSBPT's Model Practice Act, which provides guidance to states on licensing rules and professional expectations. And then we also looked at some specific occupational licensing requirements across a number of different states, as well as the physical therapy compact requirements. And then, so across all of this, our goal was to really find the requirements that were more or less common across jurisdictions. And then finally, for public and patient safety, we reviewed a mix of national and international organizational guidance. So we looked at things like materials from the Centers for Disease Control or the World Health Organization. We looked at peer-reviewed literature, and then we also sought feedback from subject matter experts. And all of these perspectives helped us define what safety means in the context of physical therapy and for the purpose of this project, and how it differs from more general notions of public health. And our goal here was to make sure that the safety wasn't treated as like an abstract concept, but rather something that was understood in a way that was more profession specific. So next I'm going to talk about how we measured each of these things. So for physical therapy job requirements, in that 2022 physical therapy practice analysis that I just mentioned, there's a lot of detail about work activities, knowledges, and skills. But for this study, we decided to focus in on 8 primary work activities. And we provided these descriptions to participants with a lot of information about what they meant, and they're summarized here. You can kind of take a look at them. But they fell into 8 categories: information gathering and synthesis, systems review, tests and measures, evaluation and diagnosis, development of prognosis, plan of care, and goals. And then on the next slide, oops. Oh, there we go, okay. There were 3 more activities: procedural interventions, non-procedural interventions, and patient, client, and staff safety. Okay. And then to measure occupational licensing requirements, our study examined several components of occupational licensing with, again, that goal of finding the common minimum standards. So first, we looked at the issue of good moral character. The applicants must demonstrate good moral character in some way, which often involves a criminal background check or some kind of similar ethical screening. Second was that candidates need to complete an approved academic curriculum, which is typically a program accredited by CAPTE or an equivalent recognized by the state board. And then third, states require the completion of a minimum amount of clinical education, again, based on the CAPTE standards. And then lastly, as you all know, the licensing process culminates in the successful passing of the NPTE, which serves as the standardized measure of entry-level competence across jurisdictions. And then finally, our task was to define public and patient safety. And here, you can read the definition. I'm not going to read it to you, but I would just highlight that the definition includes that it's geared towards activities aimed at protecting individuals and communities from harm and creating environments where risks are minimized. Okay, and then on the next slide, I'm going to, so to answer each of the questions, we created these survey items that were going to directly create connections between the job requirements, licensing requirements, and public or patient safety. So for the first research question, we asked participants to evaluate whether specific licensing requirements like background checks, clinical education, or academic coursework are necessary to perform work activities safely and effectively. And you can see that we used a 5-point agreement scale for these, with the low end being strongly disagree and the high end being strongly agree. And for the next research question, on research question 2, we focused on the link between job requirements and safety. So here, respondents rated whether correctly performing a given work activity was important for maintaining safety, again, using a 5-point scale, but that strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then we had a follow-up question that we asked them to assess the risk if that activity was performed poorly. And that is also on a 5-point scale, but a different scale ranging from no risk to very high risk. And this is the consequence of harm. What would happen if it wasn't done correctly? Next slide. So then finally, for the third research question, we first asked about the direct link between licensing requirements and safety, with items assessing whether requirements like demonstrating good moral character or completing educational and assessment requirements help safeguard the public. And here again, we use that 5-point rating scale. And then as a follow-up to that question on the next slide, we asked what level of risk might occur if those requirements were not met. And here again, we had that 5-point risk scale. So across all of the research questions, these survey items gave us both quantitative ratings and qualitative explanations, creating a rich data set to evaluate how licensing requirements align with job demands and patient safety. So next, we took that information and we conducted a focus group, or 2 focus groups, with the same group of subject matter experts that participated in the surveys. So the goal was here for us to identify survey prompts where there were lower average ratings or where there were higher standard deviations, which would indicate that there was a lack of agreement between the SMEs. So initially, we set a threshold for average ratings at 3.0, which would be at that midpoint of that 5-point scale. And we set a standard for the standard deviation of anything greater than 1, we would take a closer look at. So in the focus groups, we used a modified Delphi method where for each prompt that met our criteria, we would ask the SMEs to discuss their ratings, to talk about the high ratings and the low ratings, so that people could describe why they chose to give that particular rating. And that gave the whole group different perspectives to consider in their rating process. So after that robust discussion, the SMEs were then asked to re-rate the prompts based on their knowledge of what they now have heard from all of their colleagues. This method is generally considered more robust than survey responses alone, as it ensures that SMEs have a more complete understanding of the topic that they're rating, and it allows them to consider different perspectives. And this method is really particularly effective for complex topics like the one that we were talking about here. And now I'm going to turn it to Lauren to talk about the study results.
Okay, hello. So before we get into the results, I want to just quickly go over some of the characteristics of our sample. So we did have those 26 subject matter experts, and they were, in terms of demographics, the group was majority female at 58%, white at 84%, and non-Hispanic or Latino at 92%. And these demographic characteristics actually closely resemble those of physical therapists nationwide, with those statistics being 67% female, 76% white, and 95% non-Hispanic or Latino. So our sample consisted of highly experienced professionals in physical therapy with an average of nearly 35 years in the field, ranging from 20 to 56 years of practice. Participants also represented a variety of primary practice settings. The largest proportion worked in post-secondary academic institutions. Other settings included non-clinical environments, such as regulatory, legal, public health, or publishing roles, hospital-affiliated outpatient clinics, acute care hospitals, and non-hospital outpatient clinics. A large portion brought regulatory expertise. 73% had experience serving on licensing boards, and the same percentage had experience writing and PTE exam items. So our first set of findings looked at how job requirements align with occupational licensing requirements. And you'll notice that some values in the table are bolded. Those were the ones flagged for discussion for the focus group sessions. Across the board, completing the clinical education requirement received the highest ratings, averaging 4.92 out of 5, suggesting that our SMEs saw it as most critical for ensuring safe and effective practice. Similarly, completing the academic curriculum also scored very highly, averaging 4.84, showing strong alignment across all job activities. By contrast, demonstrating good moral character, which included things like background checks, scored lower, but still on the higher end of the scale at 3.99 on average. One participant explained their perspective on the criminal background check by saying the passing of the criminal background check is only a snapshot. It's the minimal amount of objective information we could gather to actually trust somebody with that private information. And this highlights that while important, moral character checks, depending on how they are done, can be seen as less comprehensive than education-based requirements in ensuring a public safety. So in the survey, participants had an opportunity to share additional comments. Several individuals emphasized the complexity of evaluating good moral character and noted that factors such as the context and timing of an infraction matter a great deal. And that is reflected in the quote on the left and the top right. The quote on the bottom right is one that highlighted specifically that a criminal background check is very important because people are known to push limits. And I'll pause for a few seconds if you want to look those quotes over. All right, our next set of findings, we asked our SMEs about the connection between physical therapy work activities and patient safety, and our results were consistent. So across nearly all job tasks, there was strong agreement that performing them correctly is critical to safeguarding the public and patients. the average rating across work activities was 4.8 with a standard deviation of 0.4, indicating a high level of agreement about the importance of job performance in safeguarding public and patient safety. Further, when we asked the question about the risks of failing to perform these tasks, the numbers were slightly lower, with a scale average of 4.25 and a standard deviation of 0.8, but still high. In other words, our subject matter experts clearly see that mistakes or lapses can have real safety consequences, but the perceived level of risk varies by activity. For example, tasks involving direct patient safety and evaluation were rated as particularly critical, while activities like non-procedural interventions were seen as carrying somewhat less risk. When participants rated an activity as having at least moderate risk to public patient safety when failing to perform that activity competently, they were asked to provide some examples which added some important context to our findings. Participants described some potential harms, such as patients could experience injuries, infections, or delayed healing. Errors in diagnosis might mean dangerous conditions go unnoticed. Poor treatment planning could lead to ineffective or prolonged care, and lapses in supervision or documentation could create legal or ethical problems. They also pointed out some broader system-level risks, like communication breakdowns or inadequate infection control, which can compromise safety not just for individual patients, but across entire care settings. Taken together, these findings reinforce a clear message. The work that PTs do on a daily basis is really inseparable from patient safety, and competence in these tasks is foundational to protecting the public. And here are some more direct quotes from our SMEs that illustrate the kinds of risks that can arise from poor performance of each activity. When performing tasks related to information gathering, mistakes can happen due to misunderstanding a patient's culture or not correctly following privacy laws. Mistakes related to evaluation and diagnosis can result in a PT treating the wrong issue. Incorrect development of a plan of care can lead to re-injury or inability to return to normal life roles. One subject matter expert mentioned that a lack of cultural competence can make patients and staff feel unsafe or unsupported. And issues around non-procedural interventions can result in undue financial burden on patients or even fraud investigations. All right, and our next set of findings on occupational licensing requirements and public patient safety showed the requirement most strongly associated with safety was completing the clinical education component, which received the highest ratings from our SMEs with an average of 4.73 and a standard deviation of 0.44. So this reinforces the idea that supervised hands-on training is indispensable for preparing PTs to protect patients. Closely behind that was completing the academic curriculum, which also scored very highly with an average of 4.69. Together, these two requirements highlight that knowledge and applied practice form the foundation to safe and effective care. Demonstrating good moral character, such as through background checks, while still rated positively, was seen as less directly tied to safety outcomes and received the lowest average rating at 4.31. Participants noted that while it does provide a layer of assurance, it cannot substitute for clinical or educational preparation. The highest risk ratings were also tied to education and training, with completing the clinical education requirement having an average of 4.62 and completing the academic curriculum with an average of 4.42, reinforcing the idea that lack of training and education poses substantial safety risks. Subject matter experts emphasize that if these components are missing, the potential for harm to patients is significant. One respondent captured this perspective well in the quote here, noting that the needs of our patients have evolved. If one area fails, the standards set for the other two also fail. In short, maintaining high standards of clinical and academic preparation is seen as essential to ensuring patient safety. In the additional comments section of our survey, one person shared their perspective on exam performance and how it doesn't always align with safe practice because of people's differing abilities, which highlights the importance of looking at a combination of factors to determine whether a PT should be licensed. So as a brief reminder of our method, from our initial survey responses, we flagged any survey prompts with average ratings below a threshold. Our initial threshold was an average of 3 with a standard deviation greater than 1, but no responses fell below that 3.73 mark, so we changed our threshold to an average rating of 4. We then hosted 2 focus groups with our 26 SMEs. We organized the 12 survey prompts that were flagged for discussion by our research questions, and we ended up with 8 prompts related to our first research question, 1 related to the second, and 3 related to the third. And again, we used a modified Delphi method to reach greater consensus among our SMEs. So the survey prompts that corresponded with our first research question concerned work activities and the licensing requirement of demonstrating good moral character. The SMEs had some difficulty rating this requirement because they struggled to operationalize good moral character without a consistent way to measure and enforce it. Additionally, multiple participants pointed out that criminal background checks alone are not a sufficient measure of good moral character because individuals can pass them and still engage in unethical conduct or fail them due to past mistakes unrelated to their current or future moral behavior. This quote from one SME illustrates this struggle, stating that good moral character is really important for all the work activities, but how do you definitively say that someone has good moral character or doesn't? Many participants also pointed out that most ethical infractions seen by a regulatory board are committed by senior PTs. Thus, there's a need for an ongoing assessment of moral character after the initial licensing stage. Despite issues with measurement, there was general agreement among the participants that good moral character is relevant for PT work activities, especially the ones highlighted in green on the table, or the bottom 4, as these tasks involved trust, patient safety, documentation, and ethical decision-making. And this is also reflected in the re-ratings of those prompts following the focus groups, as that average increased after those discussions. And the average ratings of the work activities highlighted in orange, or the top 4, either decreased or stayed the same following the focus group discussions. And this was because the ability to effectively collect and evaluate patient information was seen as separate from a person's moral character. So there was one survey prompt flagged for discussion related to our second research question. When discussing the risk to safety if a PT were to fail to competently perform non-procedural interventions, which included documentation, communication, education, and delegation of the plan of care, participants generally agreed that the risk is high. Improper patient record keeping or poor communication can lead to inappropriate patient treatment harm or legal liability. And the quote here from SME states that the record keeping is essential, specifically when it comes to legal defense and malpractice. And the table shows that the average ratings for this prompt following the discussions increased compared to the initial survey, and that standard deviation decreased, again showing increased consensus. So finally, related to our third research question, participants discussed the risk to public patient safety if a PT did not meet 3 occupational licensing requirements. The first of these was demonstrating good moral character, which was seen as essential for preventing harm to patients due to dishonesty, unethical conduct, or boundary violations. However, participants again raised concern about measuring and defining moral character. The second licensing requirement discussed was completing the academic curriculum. This was seen as highly relevant to maintaining public patient safety because without completing the curriculum, an individual cannot pass practical exams, which are a minimum requirement for preparing competent PTs. And failing to reach that minimum was seen as posing substantial physical, emotional, or financial risk to patients. And the third requirement discussed was passing the national exam, which was discussed and re-rated only by our second focus group because of time constraints within the first. So this topic was re-rated by 8 of our SMEs. And as you can see from the quote on the slide, passing the national exam was considered a strong indicator of a PT's minimum competence, and thus failure to pass it would pose a high risk to public patient safety. And then the table shows that the average ratings for demonstrating good moral character and passing the national exam increased following our focus group discussions, while the average ratings for completing the academic curriculum stayed the same. And the standard deviation for all three of these decreased, indicating that greater agreement among participants. All right, and of everything discussed within our focus groups, the prompts with the most robust conversations were those dealing with good moral character. So I've included a few more quotes here to give you some additional insight into those discussions. Essentially, these quotes discuss the difficulty of measuring someone's honesty and their ability to make decisions that are in the public's best interest, and the limitations of a criminal background check as it aligns to someone's character, especially over time. And I can give you a few seconds to look at those too. And I'll hand it over.
Okay. Next, I'm going to just back up a second and look at a summary across all the research questions, because I feel like we just threw a lot of data at you, and I just wanted to summarize all of it for you. So looking at the quantitative findings for the first research question, we can see that the survey prompt dealing with good moral character had the lowest mean at 4 and the most variability with a standard deviation of 0.89. This was reflected in the focus group discussion, which highlighted the importance of good moral character in safeguarding patient trust and ethical conduct, the issues around the operationalization of good moral character, and then a call for the ongoing assessment of good moral character after initial licensure. So for the second research question, performing work activities competently was rated as strongly linked to public and patient safety, with averages above 4 and standard deviations below 1. So these results align with the focus group discussions, which provided abundant examples of potential negative outcomes, ranging from physical injury to misdiagnosis and ethical breaches if these work activities were not performed correctly. And then finally, the results for the third question showed that occupational licensing requirements were also strongly linked to public and patient safety, with averages again above 4 and standard deviations below 1. The focus group discussions related to this research question highlighted the connection between licensing requirements and safety, citing the importance of competence and readiness for practice. So in summary, the lowest ratings and those that tended to have the highest variability centered around good moral character. There were wide-ranging opinions on these requirements, with some participants viewing good moral character as a foundational element of public trust, and others expressing skepticism about its operationalization, noting that the requirement is often vague, inconsistently defined, and at risk of subjective or uneven enforcement across jurisdictions. Next, our method really proved successful. The process of using the Delphi method, involving the initial survey ratings and then focus group discussions, led to stronger SME agreement in the final ratings. And our final results showed strong evidence for the existence of positive linkages for each of the research questions. None of the individual average linkage ratings fell below 3.58 on a 5-point scale, which is well above that scale midpoint of 3.0. And the ratings for only 3 out of 48 linkages were above the standard deviation of 1, showing strong consistency among the raters. And the next slide. Our findings show that physical therapy licensing requirements are generally well aligned with both job demands and patient safety expectations. Education and clinical training in particular stood out as the most critical components for ensuring competence. And at the same time, requirements like demonstrating good moral character are supported, but our results suggest they could benefit from more clear definitions and more consistent application. Beyond the findings themselves, this study contributes something new from a methodological standpoint. We've developed a novel, evidence-informed approach that ties together job requirements, licensing standards, and public and patient safety. And this is also the first time, to our knowledge, that primary data have been used to triangulate these connections in a healthcare profession. Perhaps most importantly, the framework we piloted here can serve as a replicable model for other safety-sensitive occupations. So by extending this kind of analysis to other professions, we can begin to better understand how licensing influences safety and adapt standards to meet evolving workforce and public needs. Future research recommendations include conducting this study for other professions to see if the results are replicated. In addition, looking at licensing components and how they impact safety outcomes over time could also be very interesting. And this type of method could be applied at the jurisdictional level to look in more detail at the specific requirements for a jurisdiction. And finally, we think there would be merit in further exploring the requirements and use of good moral character and identifying best practices for measuring good moral character. With that, we're going to go to our audience question and participation segment.
Hello? Oh, yes. So if you haven't done this yet, you can use the QR code or go to slido.com and use the code to access our specific questions. We have a few, so we would love to have everyone join.
So we'll have you answer these few questions. We'll talk about, and then we'll pull up the responses, and then at the end, we're going to have an open question for any questions you have about the study.
So our first question is, which licensing component has the greatest impact on public patient safety in your experience?
This is a word cloud, so the things that appear larger on this screen are things that have been said more frequently, but it doesn't account for, like I see a couple of folks have mentioned education, but like one person said clinical education, another said education, so it doesn't count those as one. Looks like we may have all the responses that we're going to get on this one. It looks like clinical education came up. Any comments on this from folks, or do these results surprise you, or is this what you would expect? It does seem to align with some of the results that we talked about really nicely. I'm just curious if anyone has any additional thoughts they want to share related to this.
Okay, now I'm really Karen from Ohio. I'll try not to be a Karen, but I was a director of clinical education for 14 years, and just something that just sticks in my mind so much is the amount of time that our clinical instructors spend with our students is so much more one-on-one time than we ever during 3 years of an academic program spend with a student. So I wasn't surprised with the clinical education rising to the top, just because they're immersed with the actual patients, real world, and just that opportunity to see that student for so much time.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments, or anyone disagree? Anyone see other things that they think are important?
Hi, I'm Bernadine from Washington, D.C. I have to always stipulate, not from Washington. But my thing is, what I notice is the clinical education part, but that also ties into morals and ethics. We start to see some of those when we put the students in the clinic. My curiosity would be what the students think are most important. Because we think one thing, but especially as we move forward with the generations, I'm curious to think if what their 4 top things are, and I have a sneaky feeling it's not on our list right now. So that's one of my questions.
That's very interesting and a great question.
I'm Missy from Ohio, and I would just observe, though, that as a administrative professional for the boards, I don't consider clinical education to be a singular component. It's wrapped up with their overall graduation requirements under a CAPTE accredited program. So I had trouble when you kind of identified that as a separate component. And the reason I say that is I've had actually discussions with Karen about their clinical supervisors and sometimes the hesitance to fail them. But this really underscores the importance of a clinical advisor being willing to fail someone that they don't think is fit for the profession. Does that make sense?
I'm Molly. I'm from South Carolina. One of the things that's important about clinical education is it gives that student the opportunity to practice what they've learned. And if they have a poorly prepared clinical supervisor, they get into some really bad habits. They might be doing things wrong that they didn't know were wrong because they didn't get that on-site correction. And so as a profession, we have to be very careful about who we choose to mentor our young people so that they mentor them in, raise them up the way that they should go, and they will follow that path kind of thing. And when I was a student, I was used as free labor through one of my clinicals. So I've experienced a bad CI.
Laura with the Iowa Board. I was just going to kind of piggyback a little bit off of what Bernadine had said and what some others or asked, and then what some others had said. When you were going through this, so I'm an occupational therapist and was currently working through some research centered around professional identity formation. And so as you were kind of going through some of this to get perspectives from that qualitative side, what came to mind for me was just some of the research that I had looked through that helps students sort of form the identity within their profession centered around the values, right, which would then relate to them being able to practice under the rules and laws under their respective disciplines. And one of the things that I found pretty frequently within the research was the modeling piece, right? And so when we're picking those best fits for clinical experiences and who's going to help them in terms of the modeling piece, because that's a vital part for them, and more often than not, they need that opportunity to get out kinesthetically to do the work, right? But for them, that modeling piece is so paramount for them to then form that identity within the profession itself, and then to be able to speak to the values of the profession. So in thinking about your question, Bernadine, that's what came to me. Like, I think they want somebody to be able to model that shows them the essence of the profession, and I think that would probably be pretty high up in their wants.
The other thing that comes to mind when I see that big clinical education is, I was both. I was a CI before I became an educator. I look at the requirements they asked me to do to teach in the classroom. It was a lot. It was a lot. But what were the requirements they asked of me to be a clinical instructor? I don't think I got any. And I think the importance of it needs to match the training and the support we give to clinical people. Our practice acts don't support them. They don't get any credit for supervising these students. They don't get any pay. And we don't give them any training. So if the research is showing how important it is, I think what we require of them and the support we give them should match it.
Craig Miller from Michigan. I appreciate the comments that everyone has said. And in Michigan, this is an opportunity for us being here as a group to see what we can do to help in each jurisdiction. Michigan does allow and has a carve-out specifically to give CE or PDRs, we call them, for having clinical students. So that's an opportunity to look at your rules and that to see if that is something that can be added. And I appreciate Missy's comment about a clinical educator being willing to fail a student, but to the comment about having a CI that maybe wasn't quite up to par, it being incumbent on the institutions to also not utilize organizations or individuals that may not be able to provide the clinical education that they expect.
Why don't we go to our next Slido response?
So our next question is, how is good moral character measured in your jurisdiction?
And this is one where you can select multiples. Looks like almost everyone said a one-time criminal background check. And the smaller number said letters of reference and recommendation. And 8% said other. I'm really curious what the other is. Is anyone willing to share what if they responded other, what they were thinking of?
Hi, Kathy Arney from North Carolina. The other depends on some of their answers to the application form. So, for example, have you had any kind of disciplinary action by another state? Have you had a conviction for X, Y or Z? And then they're requested to provide a written statement and additional information.
Anyone else?
I'm Paige. I work in licensing for the Minnesota board. I also selected other, so we do require the background check as well, but one of the things why I selected other is we ask the school to let us know if the applicants have had any like disciplinary action in school that's not necessarily like something that would show up on a background check. So, you know, did they get in trouble with their program, something like that.
I just have a follow-up for you. Are the schools willing to, it sounds like they are, but they're willing to share that information with you?
Right, yep. So we have like a form we send to the program directors, and then they will fill that out and send it back.
Interesting.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Martin from Louisiana. We don't send a form to the schools, but we do have the question about have you been in trouble with your academic program, along with other questions. And along with those two others, I also, and those were sort of in line with why I was saying other, but one thing that wasn't up here is even though it's a one-time criminal background check, we also participate in the RAP-BAC program. So if individuals are fingerprinted at any point in the future, if they have been fingerprinted by our board at initial licensure, we will receive a push notification that they've been fingerprinted. So that's another way. Well, that's actually after their license. Are we only talking initial licensure?
This study focused on that, but I'm interested to hear about other, because this study also pointed to that need for ongoing assessment of good moral character. I'm really interested to hear that that's a way you're addressing that.
So I'm Other Lauren from FSPPT, and I just wanted to, along the same lines, is we do get schools that reach out to us. Schools have to validate graduation in order, they're CAPTE educated, they have to validate their graduation in order to access the NPTE. We do get schools periodically that reach out to us and say, this person's done, they're not going to graduate, and it's typically a moral character issue. We had one reach out to us that said a student committed a pretty serious HIPAA violation. Sometimes they'll get kicked out for academic issues. So that is, again, kind of an implicit measure, but it goes to the sense that even there, you're not only using the criminal background check.
Tammy from Missouri, and may I ask a follow-up question to the person from Minnesota? So as you were talking about the learner, you send a form to the learner's program. So I'm assuming that there is some sort of permission granted by each learner that allows for that form to be sent. And are you only doing that for your programs in Minnesota, or if you have somebody who, for example, graduated from a program in Missouri, are you sending that form to the Missouri institution as well?
Yeah, so the form is called, it's the certification of education, we call it. And there's two sections. So the top, the student will fill out and basically, sign and say that they're okay with their school providing that information. And then after that, the person from the school, typically the program director can then fill out the bottom part and indicate that.
And so Missouri has a certification like that, but I don't think it specifically says they have good moral character. It more attests to that they will be completing the program. Does yours have specific language about good moral character while they were a learner?
So it's worded, so there's two questions on there related to that. So one is if there's any derogatory information, and then if there's any disciplinary action on the student's file while they were in school. So it doesn't, specifically talk about character per se, but just going towards, any discipline.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Sandra from Montana. I just wanted to point out that one of the options for other is we just require on renewal that they report to us if they have had a DUI or any other kind of criminal thing. So it's not a background check, but it is sort of an ongoing thing.
Another question from the Minnesota lady. Emmanuel, Physical Therapy Board of Colorado. How do you deal with internationally educated applicants applying for their first license in Minnesota if their school's way out in the other side of the globe?
So for, internationally trained applicants, sometimes, depending on the school, we'll ask them if we've been in contact with them, to fill out that form. But if they're not able to, more so for the internationally trained, we would rely on their FCCPT report more so than our, individual forms related to education. So that would be the same for our transcript requirement as well, is typically we would just look at that FCCPT report.
Any other thoughts on other or any of the other good moral character measures?
Just very quick to support what they're saying in Hawaii. I'm Cindy Tamayo from Hawaii. The large majority of applicants that we do turn down are because of inaccuracies in filling out their application and not disclosing any kind of legal action or whatever. And so that by far is the number one thing, and that is moral character, if they're going to lie on the application. And when I talk to students, I tell them all the time, if you had a problem, disclose it, because for the most part, it's like DUI when you're in college or something like that. Just tell them and say you're sorry, and we'll be fine. But if you lie, it isn't going to happen. So it's really about disclosing the errors you've made. That shows more moral character than anything, is just accepting that you made a mistake and let's move on, I made a mistake. So I said it, but if you couldn't, Cindy Tamayo, Tamayo, Tamayo from Hawaii.
I think we'll go on to the next question then.
So our next question is, would you or your jurisdiction be open to exploring alternative methods of evaluating a good moral character? Yeah, maybe we should have separated. Would you consider what's your jurisdiction? I think the responses are in.
Looks like the numbers have stopped moving, so it looks like a little over half of you said yes, and then just under half of you said, I'm not sure. And I'm curious to know, like, why are you not sure? Like, what is it? Someone mentioned this is really two questions, me or my jurisdiction. I'm curious your thoughts here.
Missy from Ohio. And I mean, I would just mention that a lot of states have removed reference to good moral character from their law. In Ohio, we cannot, I mean, when you put it as a background check, we can do a background check. But we are also limited by which convictions we could use to deny a license. We are severely limited. There has to be a nexus to the profession. And so that is not unusual. That is a law that's standard, or that a lot of states are passing. So that was the I'm not sure from my perspective.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen from Wisconsin, and I want to echo what Missy said, that's a conversation we're having, and it's partly motivated by conversations about second chances and helping people who have been previously involved in the justice system get back into the conventional workforce, because there's a lot of evidence that shows that the best way to prevent recidivism is to have a good job. And so there is a big push to evaluate good moral character clauses, to remove them from many professions, and to consider or acknowledge that they're really vague and subjective, and that things like criminal background checks are very specific, and that's why some of those tools remain. But the broader subjective evaluation of, is this a good person and do they deserve a license? Those clauses are being more are scrutinized more and are, as Missy said, being eliminated.
Emmanuel, Colorado. In our board, we could only make recommendations, but then once the recommendation goes to our program director, the program director has to escalate it upwards. So ultimately, we're not the decision makers, even though it's just, if you would think, it's only a small thing. This is like how many people does it take to turn a light bulb, kind of a thing. So when we try to make some changes on the statutes, has to go through a lot of process and eventually it has to go up, way up, before we could make a decision. So it's not, personally I would, but I could not speak for myself because I'm not a full representative of the board. It has to be a consensus about with everything. And we have to actually ask everybody from the DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, if they're okay with it. So it's not that easy for us.
I'm just, in pure self-interest here, pitching a follow-up. Nexus to the profession sounds like one of those very lawyerly terms that sounds good on paper, but is really highly subjective. But there were some talented researchers that could help to define what nexus to profession means for healthcare professions. I think that would be fantastic follow-up work.
Any other thoughts on this methods of exploring good moral character? All right, we can go to the next slide. This slide shows this is a QR code to an executive summary of the report of this study, in case you'd like to take a look at that. It's posted on the HRRI, the new HRRI website. So feel free to go to that. And I'd like to just open it up and see if anybody has any other questions or comments related to the study overall that we just presented on.
Craig Miller from Michigan. I was curious about the demographic information that you had. You know, said that the idea of the clinical practice hub being extremely important. But if I read the graph right, more than 50% of the SMEs, I think you call them, weren't in direct clinical practice. Was it one question that they could only pick one option, or, you know, because at least I have colleagues who teach, but then they also work, say, part-time or like on a, you know, contingent type basis in a hospital setting, outpatient clinic, what have you. So I was just curious if it was one question, they could only pick one job that they had, or if they could select more than one.
So I just want to go, I think maybe, Lauren, if we scroll back to that slide, I want to see if you're talking about the primary practice setting question. Yeah. So, yeah, they could only select one on this because we wanted to know, like, what do you spend most of your time doing? And so there was kind of a range. Like, there were folks that were more focused on academics. And then if you look across, like, there were some in outpatient care. So I think 11% were non-patient care. I don't remember off the top of my head what the other, when someone selected other, but it was kind of a mix between them.
This is Tammy from Missouri, and I had a similar question. Your thoughts on the sample being only 26, and then the other thought, and I know you said you wanted more than 10 years of experience, and so I'm looking at it kind of also from a generational perspective. And so just some of your thoughts on how you got the sample and chose or felt like 26 was an appropriate number from a power perspective, et cetera.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've tried to implement in some of our research is this idea that we call like a super SME. And so it's a person that's really deeply knowledgeable about an area that they're going to be responding to in a survey. And when we do that, we find that we can sometimes use a smaller sample versus like, for example, the practice analysis that was done. There were thousands of people who were sampled, and you wanted, the goal there was to get this wide representation. This was more about finding experts to really comment on something, which is why we thought like a sample around the size of 30 would be appropriate. And so that's kind of how we got there. And I think there was a second part to your question that I just forgot.
I think it was more the years of working in PT, and I know you said greater than 10.
Yes.
But as an educator, I'm thinking about all of the different generations that, and the change in individuals as classically as if you put them in that generation level, and what the thought process is and how
Yeah.
that might influence your results.
I think it's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Like the correlating with years of experience is age and generation. And so if we had folks that were closer, if we had an average that was more like 15 years of experience, would this look slightly different? It's possible. Yeah. It'd be a good follow-up study to see if, a broader range of people or different age groups and different perspectives.
In particular, I was thinking the question about good moral character may vary more across generations, probably not the safety or some of those other things, but just curiosity.
That's a great point. And, if we do end up doing any future research related to the good moral character, I think that would be an important characteristic to kind of pull out, like making sure to target people from different generations, because I suspect you're right.
Hello? Yes, Christina from Louisiana. And I think you answered it in saying that you picked subject matter experts, that was really important due to the sample size. But I was wondering if most of the people were in regulation or in academics. I wouldn't find it surprising that you would get the results that you have, because they obviously believe that these things are important, as opposed to testing maybe practitioners in general.
So as a primary affiliation, I'm not sure that we had regulation as an option in our responses for primary practice setting, but
I think there was one that said most regulator experience. Yeah, so 73% were regulators.
Or had been
Yeah,
at some
that's really-
point, had some experience, yeah.
So I had a question. Jeff Lau, Utah. I was curious if you, as a follow-up, might consider other ways of measuring the patient safety part of it, rather than just getting essentially a Delphi study, subject matter expertise, but actually measuring patient safety issues and triangulating it with that, with real world outcomes versus just opinions about what might be important. Again, I don't know what that would look like, but maybe correlating, if the question is about good moral character, are those jurisdictions that require that and measure that in some way, do they have lower incidence of patient safety concerns, or other things where we can triangulate these things so that we do address maybe some of the potential bias, confirmation bias that might exist in the particular sample of experts who've been brought up in this system, believing that these things are important, or at least coming to that conclusion. So it'd be interesting to see if there are real world outcome ways to triangulate this kind of thing. So I don't know what that would look like, but it'd be interesting.
I agree with you, and thanks for saying that. And I think it's one of the challenges in this area in general is that like a comprehensive place where safety data is collected is hard to come by, and there's varying levels of transparency around reports of disciplinary actions or other things, like, you know, across all boards across the country. And so I think it would be a really interesting study. I definitely think figuring out how to measure that would be tricky. Not that it couldn't be done. And if you have any other ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Maybe there's something in the ELDD that might be a potential measure. I don't know.
That would be interesting. Any other thoughts or questions? Or I think we're just at the 5-minute mark.
Charlotte Martin from Louisiana. So that just gave me a little idea that I'll just put out there. So recently I heard about, I think it was Nancy Hirsch was saying that there was a study where a lot of the violations that are being found by boards are more related to administrative issues. So like paperwork issues, things like that. And looking at what the board data looks like in the ELDD about the reported discipline and what is considered patient safety issues more than like a CE issue or non-renewal, things like that. And maybe, you know, somehow teasing out that concept of like, these are the harms that are occurring, and then what could be, I don't know, tying some sort of research to that would be a really good idea. I'm not even going to get into it that long.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. We just want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to fill out the review from the for the course. There should be a QR code coming up. If not, it's on the way out. There is a poster, I believe, that should have that QR code available. Perfect. Thank you.